We're going to move on to our second keynote talk for this morning, and we have the immense pleasure of having Dr. Peter Schulam from Johnson & Johnson MedTech, who's the Chief Scientific Officer there, to give the talk, Future of Surgery. In his role, Dr. Schulam works across the J&J MedTech, medical, and scientific communities to develop real-world policies, practices, and technologies that improve outcomes for patients. Additionally, he leads the Global MedTech Regulatory Affairs Organization and serves as co-chair of the Johnson & Johnson Data Science Council. Prior to joining Johnson & Johnson, Dr. Schulam served as the chair of the Department of Urology at Yale School of Medicine and chief of the Department of Urology at Yale New Haven Hospital. He was a professor there in urology and surgery and nationally recognized as a clinician for his expertise in minimally invasive surgery, robotics, and telesurgery, which you're going to see very relevant for his talk today. He was the interim director of Yale Cancer Center and physician-in-chief of Smilow Cancer Hospital from September 2015 through 2016. What I was very impressed with, chatting with him, getting to know him, was that he co-founded the Yale University Center for Biomedical and Interventional Technology, which is an interdisciplinary initiative to foster greater innovation in MedTech, catalyzing device innovation, improving clinical efficiency and efficacy, and lowering healthcare costs. Prior to joining Yale, Dr. Schulam was the Henry E. Singleton Professor of Urology of the Ronald Reagan Medical Center at University of California, Los Angeles, where he served as Vice Chair of Urology, Chief of the Division of Endourology and Minimally Invasive Surgery, and Director of the Surgical Living Kidney Donor Program. He has received multiple grant awards exceeding $17 million, upholding a prolific science group, holds multiple patents, 90 peer-reviewed publications, 14 books, and presented at multiple lectures across the nation and worldwide. I think what's very unique for why we asked him to speak here is that he does have that experience. Over dinner, appreciated that he is a true academic. I can vouch for that, and a surgeon and clinician, even though he's also working heavily in Johnson & Johnson MedTech. But he also has that MedTech exposure and experience, and in innovating and being able to fuse all that together and bring that to Johnson & Johnson MedTech, where you're going to be able to see in his talk from that lens, the future of robotics, AI, digital platform for the future of surgery. So with that, Dr. Schulam, we're delighted to have you here today and looking forward to your talk. And I keep stepping over this big step, but you can do it properly. Okay, you can come up this way too. Thank you very much, Peter.
Thank you very much. Hubert, thank you very much. I also want to thank you and the organizing committee for the invitation. It's an honor to be here. It's my second time back at University of Minnesota. Incredible organization, and very impressed with what's going on with MedTech and med devices here. What I'd like to share with you today is just over the next 20-25 minutes, kind of my learnings over the last 30 years in academia and then the past 6 years at Johnson & Johnson. It was a huge leap for me. I've learned a lot, and I will tell you that this talk is really meant to be thought-provoking and just thinking about where we're going and why we're where we are today and where we may be headed. And I'm still learning. I tell everyone I know very little. I'm humbled to be speaking in front of you. I'm sure, for me it's a little overwhelming, but we'll just see what we can learn together. This is the agenda for today. I wanted to start with why I did what I do and what really motivated me, the how, talk about some surgical revolutions that occurred over the last 40 years that have impacted my practice, the role of collaborations, and then final thoughts. So I begin with this. So unfortunately, as you can tell from my CV, I'm very old. I had 40 years here, so it's been around for a while. I started my residency in 1992, but this was published in 1999. I don't know if many of you have heard about it, but it's the Institute of Medicine to Err is Human. And it really had an impact on me because of what it found. And in that publication, for the first time, it was revealed that there's probably about 44,000 to 98,000 deaths per year attributed to medical errors, both diagnostic and treatment related. This was followed up by a study in 2016 at Johns Hopkins, looking at the same data and realized it was underreported. It's not that the incidence has changed, but the reporting was, they underreported at the time. And the number for deaths related to medical errors is probably greater than 250,000 per year in the United States. So that's a little overwhelming. And when you think about that, the question is why? And it's really about variability. This is an interesting paper. This paper was published in 2020. So what we're talking about, you'd say, okay, from 1999, have we made progress? So this is 2020. It was in Circulation. And what they did was they looked at 85 centers throughout the United States that do pediatric congenital heart surgery. So these surgeons are trained for decades, incredible surgeons. And those 85, I'm sorry, it was 102, and that represented 85% of all the congenital heart programs in the United States. So there's 102 centers, over 85,000 babies. And they looked at the data and they said, what was the variability in outcomes amongst those 102 centers with respect to mortality, length of stay, and complications? And I think really just looking at mortality on the left, there was a threefold variability in outcomes, threefold. And then they asked the question, okay, perhaps that variability is only at high-risk procedures. So high risk is stat 4 and 5, but stat 1 through 3 are low-risk procedures. There was no difference. Think about that. And this is in 2020. And I think human performance is really, I think we have to come to the realization that it follows the Gaussian distribution, standard deviation of 1. 64.2% of the individuals, of all of us, you operate around the mean. That's the reality. The problem is, the perception is, every surgeon out there thinks they're in the top 10%, and every patient thinks their surgeon's in the top 10%, and that's not reality. So we started thinking about this when I was at UCLA back in 2000 and asked the question, how can we impact that and what's going on? And we came up with this simple formula that performance basically is a product of skill and judgment. Skill and judgment, and you need both, and that's why it's a product. And in fact, having been a surgeon for 30 years, running 2 departments, I can tell you, regardless of where you go, there is variability here, no matter where you're at, whether at University of Minnesota, or at UCLA, or Johns Hopkins, or Yale. And I have seen great surgeons who have incredible skill, but not very good judgment, and vice versa. So it's really the need for both. And so when we started, I started a center at UCLA on medical device development before I went to Yale. And our focus was to say, should we be driving innovation that actually is augmenting skill and enhancing judgment? And every product doesn't have to do both, but in aggregate, in the operating room, if you have those devices and those innovations, hopefully the standard of care is elevated. So this is the how, and as I mentioned, this has been my research interest for the last 30 years, and now I'm seeing what I can do to impact industry, or industry helping me to solve this, because I spent 30 years and was not very successful. This was a center that we started at Yale, which was already mentioned, and this was a paper that we published in conjunction. We had a team at Yale from MIT and Yale looking at medical device design, and it's not revolutionary, but the bottom line is the process of medical device innovation is very rigorous, and if you follow the formula, it can be successful. But I think what happens is everyone deviates from this, and if you look at this, it really starts with the unmet need, and I'll end with this as well, but I don't think we all, yesterday I was walking around, very good, all the posters, everyone says we're starting with an unmet need, but I'm not sure we truly understand the unmet need. The unmet need takes hundreds of interviews to truly understand what's going on and where is the pain point that one wants to solve for. Then you have an idea, proof of concept, proof of feasibility, proof of value, initial clinical trials, validation solution, approval and launch, clinical use, standard of care. That's the cycle. Now, I think the nuance, though, and I think where we all fail, is that if you look in the center, the nuances are what you have to do at each one of these steps is think about clinical. And what does that mean? It's not just the unmet need, but it's the workflow. You can have an unmet need, you can have a great device. If it doesn't fit into the surgeon's workflow, it will fail. So you need to think about this at every step of the way. Market, business, what does that mean? Well, do you have a business model? What's the GP? What is the gross profit? What's the manufacturability? I was at Johns Hopkins as a resident, and I remember working with the Department of Engineering, and this is going back a ways, 30, 40 years ago, and we were working with Russ Taylor, unbelievable engineer, brilliant roboticist, and we were trying to develop a robot for percutaneous access to the kidney. And the robot was the size of this stage. So could accomplish the task, but it couldn't be manufactured. That was like an aha moment for me and why we need to work together. The other is regulatory. Unbelievable. What's the regulatory process in the United States, outside the United States? What about pricing? How does that work in? Are you going to be able to? So these are the things that one has to think about, and then finally the technical capabilities. So at each one of these steps, you need to be thinking of those nuances all along. And if you don't have a green light on all of them, you pivot or you kill, so you fail fast. And so it seems simple, but I would say that most of us don't follow this strictly. And now that I'm in industry, I can tell you that even in industry, we fail. So I'm going to step back now and just say, that's the why I'm here, how I'm trying to think about this, and I'm still learning. And then I just want to go over historically what I've learned over the last 40 years, because I think it's interesting when you look back in the past, we sometimes fail to do that. And over the last 40 years, to me, there's been two major revolutions, and I think we're on the precipice of a third. The first revolution was laparoscopic surgery. Late 80s, 1990s. I don't know if you recall, this is when laparoscopy came on the scene. It was laparoscopic cholecystectomy, so removal of the gallbladder. Interestingly, late 80s, early 90s, J&J actually played a big role in educating the community around this. There was very poor adoption from academic medical centers. Why should we do this laparoscopically? We can do it open. It's done very well. Patients go home in a couple days. It's great. There's no data to support this. We're not going to get paid for it. We're not going to do it. Patient demand drove this, and I would say it was the private sector that adopted it. Eventually, the academic centers came on, and then there wasn't the first RCT, randomized controlled trial, until 1993. But by then, the horse was out of the barn. Patient demand can drive adoption, and that's key. And you would say, okay, that was once, maybe it's a one-off. In 2000, robotic surgery came on the scene. And here again, it's interesting because I'm old enough to have lived through both of these. And I was an early adopter of minimally invasive surgery because I was trained at Hopkins by the surgeon who performed the first laparoscopic nephrectomy in the world. So this became my passion, was to look at technology. So I lived through the laparoscopic era. Now robots came out, and I had just finished my residency. And when the robot came out, the first indication for robotic surgery was cardiovascular, if you all recall. And it failed. It was not adopted. And they pivoted, this is Intuitive Surgical at the time, pivoted to prostatectomy. And as a urologist, I was doing laparoscopic prostatectomies. I thought this was a complete waste of money. I was capable of doing this with the same number of incisions, about the same time. We don't need this. And I was dead wrong. Because what happened was, even though I could do it, there was a demand for minimally invasive prostatectomy by patients. Very few surgeons can do it laparoscopically, so this tool became enabling. Now, it had difficulties being adopted because there was no data to suggest robotic was better than laparoscopy. Laparoscopy was still competing with open prostatectomy at the time, but this was an enabling technology driven by patient demand. And today, around the world, greater than 90% of prostatectomies in the world are done robotically. It was enabling technology, and it took a while. So we have to learn from that curve of adoption. Sometimes if it doesn't take off right away, yes, it could be possibly a dead end, or there may be reasons why it's going to take time to begin to accelerate. This is where we are today, and I think this will be the third revolution in the past 40 years. And I think we're on the precipice where it's evolving. We're not there, but I think everyone in this room, this is what we need to solve for, and I think this may have the greatest impact. And this is creating the surgical ecosystem. And what I think about this is that basically it's a surgical cockpit. If you think about the airline industry and what they have available to the pilots, even though that plane can fly on its own, there's pilots in the cockpit, but there's a lot of information that's helping standardize and removing the variability in human performance so that plane takes off, flies, and lands. We need the same level of insight in the operating room of tomorrow. I would say that, I think the vision that we all have and we all believe in is that hardware and software together can drive insights which could then augment skill, enhance judgment, improve performance, decrease variability. That's the vision. And I think we're getting there. I think some people are selling this a little too early, but I think in the next 5 years, we're going to have a significant impact. And because of two major evolutions or revolutions within the data world. One is converging technologies. Converging technologies has changed the slope of innovation. It used to be linear, and I would argue now it's almost exponential. And what do I mean? I think the phone is the perfect example of that, the smartphone. You have something now that's a portable phone, but it's a watch, it's a camera, it's a computer, it's a TV, it's linked to social media, all in a single device that's interoperable. Converging technologies. The other area that's going to have a huge impact is where we are with respect to data. And so if you look, the convergence of data density, AI maturity, and institutional momentum, things are changing. So data density, longitudinal, multimodal data is now accessible and linkable. Everyone's using that word ambient. 2, AI maturity, generative models can reason, summarize. Think about it. In the last 5 to 6 years, we've gone from machine learning to large language models to generative AI to agentic AI to physical AI. It's amazing how fast this is adopting. So things are accelerating. I don't even think anyone in this room, including myself, can predict where we're going to be 5 years from now, because I think we're going to actually undercut it. And if you look back historically at predictions for where we would be today, we're far ahead of that. And so I think it's both data and converging technologies, and then institutional momentum, health systems, industries. We're investing in the capacity, and we're actually understanding data governance and the need to actually harmonize data. So I think between converging technologies and where we are on this data journey, I think that surgical ecosystem can potentially be a reality. And so the future is not going to be, as a surgeon, it's a solo experience. It's the surgeon's skill and intuition that guides every procedure and decisions on any individual experience, but rather it's a shared intelligence. AI systems learn from millions of procedures worldwide, creates global pool of surgical knowledge of all teams, and enables greater precision, safety, and quality for patients. I think data is going to be the key. The question is, can we actually access the data? And I think there are so many other industries that are further ahead than us. And we had this discussion last night. It's going to be challenging. It's one of the reasons why it's the last industry to be converted. It's because the variables in surgery are so great. But I don't think we should be looking at autonomous surgery. We should be thinking about the low-hanging fruit and judgment enhancement, marginal skill improvement. And then as the years go on, we'll evolve into something that may be greater. But I believe this is the next revolution. I believe this is where we're going to have the greatest impact on variability of care. We're going to improve access globally for patients, and we'll decrease the unfortunate complications that are associated with healthcare today. How do we get there? So collaboration is key, and I believe that the strongest or the most beneficial collaboration we have today is academia and industry. Now, having flipped between both sides, I feel as though I can talk about this. I tell everyone, when I left academia, I was joining the dark side. I've changed that. I actually believe it's a bright side, and they want to work with us. And I feel like I'm talking from both sides of my mouth because I feel as though I still have a foot in academia. When I come to places like University of Michigan and have a dinner like I did last night, I'm excited to be back in academia. There's an excitement and enthusiasm. And what does academia bring? Academia brings creativity, basic research, foundational science, and it actually is the access or the doorway into clinical care, right? Because many of our academic medical centers, it's where a lot of our clinical science evolves. What does industry bring? And I alluded to it earlier. It brings expertise around manufacturability, business, GP, regulatory, and commercialization. So when you think about it, the two together are synergistic. And we need to figure out how to break down some of the barriers that prevent this from happening. I think we all are well-intentioned. Compliance is an issue, and we have to get around that. And I think even in the last talk, when you have to say things like, I'm afraid of what I'm going to say because I may get fired, It's a reality. And so we have to think about that. But I really believe this is one of the strongest collaborations that will lead to future success. The other is actually MedTech is not going to be able to do this on its own. And tech is not going to be able to do it on its own. And it's a collaboration between the two. And I have this here because we are now collaborating on our concept of what's called polyphonic, which will be an agnostic open ecosystem for the operating room with AWS and NVIDIA. And it's an incredible collaboration, and we're learning from each other. I will tell you, J&J is a large 134-year-old med tech company. We're a little slow, and so seeing the agility of NVIDIA and AWS is fantastic. So this is an incredible collaboration. I will give you just one of our projects that I think is incredibly cool. So with NVIDIA, they said we can do things in silica. And so we're designing robots. We have an Ottava robot that's coming to market later this year. It's for soft tissue. But we have another robot that we're working on, which is called Monarch Urology for stone treatment. And when you develop robots, you take them to a particular point, you have your ID, and then you do a limited market research. And you put it out there, or limited market launch, and you put maybe 10, 12 units out, and you gather the information from real world use. And then that helps with the development of the second iteration, something that will be used for a full market release. So NVIDIA says, why do you do that? We can create everything in silica. You can give us the patient's anatomy, you can give us the OR, and within weeks, we can drive thousands of procedures, gain insights, and shorten your development cycle. So we're doing that now today with NVIDIA, and it's incredible. I can tell you, we were talking about this last night, the use of AI is driving the time for drug discovery down. At Johnson & Johnson, we've gone from 7 years to a 2-year cycle. It's incredible. All right, so I'm going to finish up with 3 concepts, or end with 3 slides. So I'm going to end where I started. In 1992, I started my residency at Johns Hopkins, and I was influenced by 2 slides or 2 pictures. The one on the right, so I'm walking around the halls of Hopkins, new intern, very green, and the walls are replete with photographs of the operating room over the last 100 years at Johns Hopkins. And this particular photograph was from 1944. It was Dr. Blaylock doing the first blue baby surgery. And it had an impression on me, and I'll tell you why in a minute. And the second is a photomicrograph that I used in a presentation during Grand Rounds at Hopkins in 92, 93. And it's a photomicrograph of surgical instruments found at Pompeii following the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD. So I'm looking at this and I'm saying, wow. I'm looking at the surgical trays I'm using as an intern. I'm saying some of these instruments look exactly the same. It's like 2,000 years old. And then I'm looking at the right and I'm saying, well, I go to the operating room as an intern now, and I'm in the operating room looks exactly the same. I said, wait a minute, how is it? It's 1992, so it's not what we do, but it's how we do it. How can we change what we're doing? And so that became my motivation and passion over the last 30 years, and I think we've made some grounds. We now know the OR of the future, what it looks like with a robot, and but this was what really impacted me and motivated me. And I want to go back to where one of the things I mentioned earlier, the unmet need. I think we all know that we have to solve for an unmet need. I don't think we drive hard enough to understand the unmet need. And so all I would do is implore you to basically, when you think you understand the unmet need, go further, go deeper. It's really about understanding the shoes that the surgeon's walking in, or the physician if it's a procedure that you're evaluating, and really doing, when I was at Yale, we were being driven by the School of Management, and they said, you need to go out and have 100 to 200 interviews with physicians before you actually believe that unmet need, and you understand it completely. And remember, and that's why it needs to be a clinical pull, not a technological push. You know, we have a laser that does this, where can we use it? That's a bad idea. That's a failure from the start. But I will also tell you, sometimes we don't, as surgeons, know what we need. So don't give us what we want, but give us what we need. And I think laparoscopy and robotics are examples of that. Not every surgeon thought we needed those innovations at the time. And finally, get comfortable being uncomfortable. This has been my motto ever since I heard this. It was a Navy SEAL giving us a presentation. He said, the reason why we succeed in what we do is because during our training, they teach us to be comfortable being uncomfortable. And it's stuck with me. And I will tell you that the most asked question I've been asked in the last 6 years since I've transitioned to industry from academia is, why did you do it? And I tell everyone because I was starting to feel too comfortable. I was at Yale. I had an institute, 2 institutes. I was the Chief Innovation Transformation Officer for the health system. I was the department chair. I had a lot of balls in the air, but to be honest with you, I had hired people that were way smarter than me. Whether I showed up at work or not, I knew the work was going to get done. I was getting too comfortable, and I wanted to feel uncomfortable again. I will tell you, I'm 100% successful. I am incredibly uncomfortable every day. I feel like I don't know anything, and every time I'm on a call with finance people, I have my iPad open and I'm scrolling and Googling and reading Wikipedia as fast as I can so that I can learn the language of industry. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you, Dr. Schulam, for that wonderful talk. And that last point, being in Minnesota, nice territory here, it's being comfortable, feeling uncomfortable, but also making other people feel uncomfortable, I think is also important, and being comfortable with that. I'm going to open up to questions, but while people are warming up, I do have one question, and since we have ARPA H director here too, who can fund all this, I totally agree. I totally agree that no pressure. I totally agree that robotic surgery and AI can lead to enablement and improvement of surgery, and that's a very great point you made. Thinking aspirationally, though, how could we get to automated surgery for certain approaches? What would actually be needed in the infrastructure to make that happen? I mean, with Waymo, we feel a bit more comfortable, and there is a lot of data and so forth, but if we really want to push in that direction, what do we need to set up now so that in the next 10 years or 20 years, or hopefully not that far away, we could actually get to a lot more automated surgery so we can plan ahead for academics as well, because we can work in that space.
Do I have to answer that question? I think there's a couple of barriers. One is just the concept of automation of surgery, and 2, the regulatory pathway. I think surgery is a lot different than an autonomous vehicle, even though there's life at stake. I think it's different. I think the variables are different. I think what we're going to see next, and I know there's work being done. I know at Johns Hopkins they're working on a robot that does anastomosis. So I don't think we're going to have autonomous surgery as we think of it from beginning to end. But I think what will happen with time is that we're actually going to have steps of the procedure that will be automated under surgeon control, and I think that will start to lay the foundation to where we actually will be going. But I think it's going to be number one, it's adoption and buy-in from both patients and surgeons. 2, it's a regulatory hurdle. And then 3, the engineering requirements for it. I think when you think about it, where we are now and our ability with visualization and things of that nature, I think it actually is, we're getting there. I think it'll probably be 5 or 10 years before we have automated steps within a procedure, but full automation is a ways away. I used to say that autonomous surgery would never exist. I think, again, I've made many mistakes in my life. One of them was saying that the intuitive robot would not be successful. Very wrong, so thank God I'm not in finance. But I will tell you, I think we're going to get there. I think it's just going to take time, and we'll get there.
Maybe Liardi from Stem Cell Institute and Department of Dermatology. It's a very exciting story. Remind me of Steve Jobs' iPhone creation, because at the beginning people don't see you need it, but later it's become a huge success. Because I missed the question for the first one, so I'll combine both. Like your technology, like laparoscopy, where would fit the office, for example, to take example? Because I can see it's a future, at that time, it could be a huge future health, scalable solution. And for my own purpose, my technology would also prevent healthcare. So how would, maybe also the question for Taylor, how would that fit to the funding agency, the mission office, if we're going back the time clock?
Okay, so this is great. This is where I go phone a friend. So I say, Tyler.
Let me, talk to me, May. We have, there's a program already out that the solicitation is closed. It's called AIR, Autonomous Innovation, I can't remember what the acronym stands for. But anyway, that program was on some autonomous endovascular thrombosis treatment capabilities, as well as microbots that are kind of a sandbox that you can play in. But come talk to me. I did have was that answering your question?
Yes, that's
Okay.
a mission. And also another thing is, maybe I'm sorry to switch back to you again. Okay, we'll do that. But yeah, and also during the development process, how do you make decision what's your the most immediate pain to solve? Like it could be, do you want to go to the market fastest, or you want to be at the end a perfect comprehensive solution?
Yeah, so that's more of the strategy for a company like, so listen, this is new for me, but I can tell you from J&J's perspective, I think there's a difference between a large multinational company like J&J and a startup. I think in the startup, you're swinging for the fences a little bit more. I will tell you that in J&J, we have core technologies that, bring in, we have to run a business. And it's a publicly held company. So it really dictates how we respond. And I was talking to someone earlier, unfortunately, and this is not just J&J, but it's every large cap company in the world, they have to report quarter to quarter to Wall Street. And I think what that does is it makes you short-sighted, because you're not thinking about 5 to 10 years out, because you have to invest, and you don't necessarily see a return on that. And so that's been my aha within the industry. And that's why what happens, I think startups take that role and really try to drive innovation that is, let's say, white space. And then once it's been de-risked to a particular point, then it gets incorporated by a large multinational. So I think, again, if you think about the ecosystem, we need the startup and we need so if you segment the industry, it becomes really the startup and then the large cap multinational companies working in conjunction to really further innovation. I want to just say one other thing while I'm thinking about it. I think the future, if you think about it, where we are with robotics today, so the big gorilla is Intuitive Surgical. If you think about it, it's been around for 25 years. It's like a utility player, right? It's used for everything. The future, and just like everything, again, we think historically. I don't know, I'm old enough to know, like a calculator used to cost $150, and now you can get them in like a Cracker Jack box. So it's miniaturization and cost is going to drive robotics that are miniaturized and procedure specific. And I will tell you, there's a company already out there that it's actually a group of people that left Intuitive, and they're working on a robot just to place the mitral valve. The reason for that, the aortic valve is a tube within a tube, so actually it's not very difficult, and the degrees of freedom needed are not much. But to place a mitral valve, you need 6 to 7 degrees of freedom. Very difficult to do by hand, but with a robot you can. So they've done first in human already in Chile. So to me, that's the future. We're going to get away from these large, big utility robots, and we're going to have specialty-specific miniaturized robots. So we have to think about that. There's someone back there too.
Yeah, thanks, Peter, for a very exciting vision of the future. And I think it's totally believable that the vision of the information-driven surgical cockpit will happen in 3 to 5 years, certainly in the major medical centers, the MGHs and the Cleveland Clinics. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering if you could maybe provide some thoughts about the diffusion to hospitals that are away from major cities and not associated with academic health centers.
Yeah, so I was just talking to John earlier about that. I will tell you that, so interestingly, I have papers that when I was in the lab at Hopkins in 93, 94, I wrote papers with Dr. Cavusi on telesurgery, teleconsultation, telementoring, and we did the first telesurgery case between Johns Hopkins and Bangkok, Thailand, in which It was a vasectomy, and all we were doing was visualization of the surgical field, and we were turning on and off the current for the electric cautery. Doesn't sound like much, but it was 30 years ago. There's a lot more telesurgery being done today. So I think telesurgery is going to play a huge role. Now, there's a lot of naysayers out there because they say, who's going to pay for it? How does insurance companies work with it? Number two is, how do you worry about credentialing and licensing, and what about liability? But I think those are all easily overcome when we start to think about it. I think where it's going to go first is outside the US. I just learned the other day, Africa has 40 robots. They don't have the surgeons to perform, so there are now centers within Spain, one of them is Barcelona, setting up a program so that they can offer surgical expertise telesurgically with those robots, but for the patients in Africa. I think a single healthcare, if you think about a Mayo Clinic and where they are in their footprint within the United States, think about the variability they see in their care. And I'm just going to take an example. I was using this earlier. So when you do a prostatectomy, one of the key moments of the prostatectomy is when you dissect the nerves off the prostate, because that's what provides both continence, so ability to control urine, and sexual function after the procedure. Maybe that takes 5 to 7 minutes. I mean, some variability, but in this 2-hour operation, if you had an expert who basically was a hub and the spokes were all the robotic prostatectomies being done in the Mayo Clinic, could just drop in during those 5 minutes, think about the standard of care that would be changed, number one. Number two is it could be completely managed credentially and licensing from like a Mayo Clinic. And number two, cost, that's just part of Mayo's Clinic of doing business. They don't have to worry about paying that surgeon. That surgeon will be employed by Mayo Clinic. So I just think that we can, if we think hard enough, we can start to break down these barriers. But I think telesurgery, telemed, however you want to, telediagnostics like stroke prevention, how can we do a better job with stroke? So I think telesurgery is going to play a huge role. Again, it's not you're doing the whole operation 3,000 miles away, but how do you integrate the technology so that you can augment the care that's provided?
There's one question. Where's the mic?
Daniel Diremia from Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston. When you think about surgery, definitely you think about taking action and doing things and finding new tools for doing that. But in terms of quality, you want to think about metrics of what surgery or what surgical acts are successful. How do you think about the metrics of success and what technologies are needed? What metrics are not being covered by good technologies today, where there is an opportunity to develop new technologies to give surgeons a feedback of how good their actions were?
Yeah, so that's learning and education, and I think that's a component of this. But I'm gonna pivot from your question and say, where else can we use technology? So here's a reality. There are things that happen in the operating room called never events, and a never event is a wrong-sided surgery. And you would say, well, how often does that happen? Well, despite everything we've done to date, which is patients self-marking the site of surgery, timeout, checklists in the operating room, wrong-sided surgery still occurs. Just before I left Yale, at Yale that year before I left in 2020, we had 5. So technology, if we can just in some way harness the ambient data that's being done and being able to process and in some way correlate it back to the medical record, and so we know when the patient's being positioned, if it's right-sided nephrectomy, but they're being placed in the left flank up position, there should be like a warning that something is not, it's when we drive now, despite whether you have autonomous cars or not, when you start to do a little lane change and you don't have your blinker on, you're given a little warning to kind of put you back. I think, and this is why the low-hanging fruit, we're talking about grandiose things here, really just start with the things that we can truly impact and start to build those successes, and I think it'll drive greater success. But I think what you talked about is learning and education and feedback to the surgeons. That kind of exists a little bit, but it's hard to get this stuff. Our problem too is some of these technologies are great, but they don't work within the workflow. Surgeons are very busy. We can video record, we can do crowdsourcing on this information, provide feedback, but if they don't read it or they don't take the time to do it, they're not. So the question is, it's not the surgeon's fault, it's our fault, because as technologists, how can we integrate this into their workflow so that it becomes seamless and they're getting this information without having to do work to get that information?
Brian, do you want to go ahead?
Sure. Chester Coe, Baylor College of Medicine Urology.
Good,
Your
thank
alma
God
mater.
there's one urologist in the room.
My question is, so we have a lot of unmet needs in small populations, so pediatric devices or devices for rare diseases. How do we get industry more interested in those small
Yeah,
populations?
so you know what's so interesting? Where was I when I may have been at Baylor. When I was at Baylor at one point too. I did my MD PhD at Baylor. It's interesting. This is the problem with the world, right? It's all about money. And those populations are so small. The research required is no different than for another device. And the question is, who's going to fund it? So this is when I look at ARPA, and I say the government, I'm just kidding. But I don't know how to answer that. And, the bottom line is, this is my other aha, is that when I went into industry, I used to think industry was evil. And I said, why do they charge $500 for a stapler? And now that I'm in industry, I go, it's not about the plastic and metal and making the device. I can't believe the regulatory hurdles we have to jump through and the data we have to generate, not only to bring it to market, so that's registration, but to keep it on market. EU MDR, the Medical Device Regulatory Agency, and the new criteria, we had to spend over, just to become compliant with the new rules for our devices in Europe, over $1.5 billion. Who can afford that? So what's happening is a lot of small device companies are actually leaving the EU. And now the EU is saying, well, wait a minute, we don't want this to happen. What are we doing wrong here? And again, everyone is right, meaning the regulations they're putting in place was they want to increase transparency of the device industry, when it's working, when it's not, all for that. But then how they did it was so expensive that, so the question is, where do you find? So the same thing when you look at devices for small populations, like pediatric surgery, there's a lot of opportunities there, but there's not a lot of research because there's potentially no funding from, the government's not earmarking it, number one. Number two, industry's not going to pick it up because the margins will be too low. And I don't know what the solution is. I think we have to do a better job of negotiating in this world, meaning we can't get what we all want. That's the bottom line. But if we get what we need, then it's a win-win-win. So to me, I think about healthcare, right? Who's around the table? Payers, industry, health systems. How do we work better together? Unfortunately, everyone's trying to survive and grab what they can, but we're not doing that higher level collaboration that we need.
We'll do one last question. Oh,
It's like a philosophical thought, but.
okay, one more question after, last one. But you're first.
Will this work? Oh, Peter. Hello? Peter, I have to say, in my experience in industry, and I did a keynote yesterday, that's the best summary of everything I've learned since I started my career across the basement in Deal Hall many years ago.
Thank you.
The only thing I would ask about, and the thing that I've learned only recently in my experience at my company now, Solventum, is when you go through the development cycle, standard of care, I used to assume, is sufficient to drive adoption. What I've learned, it's not. Yep. And much of our portfolio suffers from this. What is your thought about why? I mean, the best I can come up with is probably it relates to economics and human psychology. Things like washing hands, we were talking about that last night. That's something we all know we need to do, and yet it doesn't always happen. Nobody admits it. What's your thought on moving from standard care to large-scale worldwide adoption because the patients that don't receive standard of care suffer from it?
Yeah.
There's no answer. I'd just be curious.
No, I think what comes to mind right away is misaligned incentives. Because you have to ask yourself, so if something is the right thing to do, why is someone not doing it? And I think that's, again, another area where we have to do a deeper understanding. I'm trying to think if I think of an example of that. But I really believe when incentives are aligned, the outcomes follow. When you have misaligned incentives, they do not. So now, for our world, medical device, So I talked about evidence. There's two levels of evidence. Evidence for registration, so to bring a product to market, and then there's evidence for adoption. And if you don't have the evidence, if you don't have evidence that demonstrates that it's superior to the other standard of care, to drive adoption, it's not going to happen. And so what happens is then healthcare systems won't pay for it. So they're going to say, look, there's no evidence to suggest this. No matter what, as a company, we say this is the best thing since sliced bread. Great. Where's the real world evidence to suggest that? If you demonstrate that, and I know there's value to it, then I can convert that, and yes, we will adopt it. So I think that's one area that I think we have to work on. I'm not going to answer your question directly, but how I think about it, I think we have to do that. And then the other, it's our obligation as an industry to drive data and evidence that changes the guidelines. So guidelines drives adoption too. So we just have a device on the market now that got great, it's Abiomed, it's an intravascular pump for heart failure. And there was a 10-year study that demonstrated it decreased mortality by 16.3% in patients who presented with myocardial infarction and cardiogenic shock. 50% mortality rate. We were able to, with this device, not we, but this company and device that we acquired, was able to decrease that by 16 points. That's value, and that can change the standard of care. Other things I think are difficult, and I think it's a misalignment. And it's the end user, so it's the physician. It could be the healthcare system, patient, or industry. So I don't have a direct answer, but I think misaligned incentives are one pain point that I see in healthcare.
Maybe we should put our heads together and bring all these smart people in to help us. Thank you.
Tim, I think we're running time, so maybe you could come up later afterwards. But a lot of great questions. Sorry to cut it. I want to give people breaks. But thank you so much, Dr. Shulam. It was a wonderful talk, a wonderful discussion. And there's going to be a lot of people lining up if you don't mind.
Thanks, Hubert.
So thank you.